We'll now begin the second part of today's briefing with our guests. Sitting in the center seat, you have Ted Chaiban, UNICEF's Deputy Executive Director for Humanitarian Action and Supply Operations. And to his left is Ida Mosorno, Director of Operations and Advocacy Division of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. They both recently traveled to Sudan and can talk about the situation there. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and thank you for coming today. Last week, Adam, our colleague Michael Dunford from WFP, and I were in Sudan, a country we know well. Both of us have worked there before. I've traveled there over the last 25 years, and unfortunately, it's a country where children have consistently borne the brunt of recurring violence, upheaval, and displacement, and this is the case again. But I also want to say there's no exaggeration that the situation that they're facing today is unprecedented. However difficult things have been in the past, it's never been this difficult. Before the war erupted on the 15th of April, Sudan was already grappling with the humanitarian crisis. Now, more than 110 days of brutal fighting have turned the crisis into a catastrophe, threatening the lives and futures of a generation of children and young people who make up over 70% of the population. The numbers are staggering. Let me just say that 14 million children, so a number roughly equivalent to every single child in Colombia, France, Germany, or Thailand, to give you an order of magnitude, are in need of humanitarian support. That's 1 out of every 2 children in Sudan who are now facing unimaginable challenges to their safety and well-being every day. 1.7 million children have been driven from their homes. Parents are making the impossible choice of deciding whether to stay or leave and leave everything behind they have known. And those children are on the move both within Sudan and in neighboring countries, vulnerable to hunger, disease, violence, and separation from their families. This 1.7 is in addition to the 1.9 million children who were already displaced within Sudan prior to the latest crisis. We issued a report a few days ago that made the point that, from what's reported, 435 children have been killed in the conflict, at least 2,025 children injured. That's an average of 1 child killed or injured every hour since the war began. And we know that that's an underestimate. The true toll is much, much higher. I saw the toll of the atrocities committed against children and women during the darkest days of the Darfur conflict 18 years ago. Both Adam and I were there. And I think we're deeply concerned that we could be looking at a repetition of these terrible days. And the ramification of this crisis is not just one for Sudan, but it goes beyond Sudan's borders. So it's impacting Chad, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, not to mention Ethiopia, Egypt, the region as a whole. The impact of this crisis is seen in the faces and stories of children, their parents and grandparents that I met while in Sudan, but also in Adre, a small village on the border between Chad and Sudan, which is now hosting hundreds of thousands of women and children who fled West Darfur for safety. I spoke to a woman called Fatma in Adre, and she told me the story of how, in order to get to Adre, she had to go through 11 checkpoints, each time having to pay her way through at risk of gender-based violence every step of the way. What we saw were children coming dehydrated, malnourished, in a very weakened state on arrival, and many of them dying because they're arriving in such poor shape. I met with a young 11-year-old in Atbara. Atbara is one of there's 2 major cities north and south of Khartoum, where people have fled to significant numbers of displaced, Atbara and Wad Madani. We were able to make it to Atbara, and 11-year-old boy described, he actually showed us a picture of a technical attacking a pharmacy right in front of his house. And again, described how difficult it had been to get out of Khartoum, wants to go back home, wants to see his friends, as you would expect. So each and every day, children are being killed, injured, abducted. They're seeing the schools, the hospitals they depend on being damaged, destroyed, and looted. We received reports of abduction, recruitment of children into armed group, ethnically targeted violence, gender-based violence against women and girls. And this is on top of, as I said, vulnerability that was there before. 3 million children under 5 are malnourished in Sudan, with 700,000 at risk of severe acute malnutrition and mortality. 1.7 million children are at risk of missing on critical vaccination, raising the risk of disease outbreaks. In White Nights now state, we currently have what is usually a lethal combination, which is acute watery diarrhea, measles, and malnutrition in the same place. And that needs to absolutely be contained because otherwise the consequences are severe. Amidst all this devastation, it was frankly inspiring to see our UNICEF and UN colleagues and other humanitarian partners staying and delivering services for children and their families. I know that Adam will speak more broadly about the UN family, but let me just say for UNICEF, we've been able to reach 3 million children and women with health supplies, 2.1 million with safe drinking water, and 2 million children with screening for malnutrition. And I spoke about severe acute malnutrition, so we've been able to get that life-saving treatment to 107,000 children. There's profound mental health consequences for children in these circumstances, and a big push is underway to provide 200,000 children and their caregivers with psychosocial counseling, learning, and protection support, but also play activities, just being a child again in over 400 safe spaces across the country. When I say across the country, this of course includes Darfur, Kordofan, Khartoum, and again, everything's being done to reach the population, but as fighting continues, it makes access difficult, and we can't overemphasize the fact that much is being done, but much more needs to be done. For UNICEF, over the next 100 days, we would need urgently $400 million to sustain and scale the crisis response to support the most vulnerable children. You know, overall, I think the message is that we can't accept the toll that this war is taking on Sudan's children, their families, and the future. I think we both remember 18 years ago the outrage that was there when the Darfur crisis was at its utmost height and horror, and we've got to do everything possible that we don't go back or that we don't further find ourselves in the same kind of situation, understanding that there's already huge, serious violations taking place. So our messages to the party of the conflict is clear. They need to stop the fighting and commit to a durable cessation of hostilities. All parties must abide by their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law to protect civilians, including preventing and ending grave violations against children. All parties need to ensure the humanitarian community can safely reach children and families in need by respecting humanitarian workers and their premises, removing bureaucratic and administrative barriers, and facilitating access. There are talks in Jeddah on the way. There are other negotiating processes that we hope and urge can make urgent progress in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Ted has set the scene on what we saw in Sudan, so I'll maybe give a few additional highlights and not to repeat what he said. And thank you for the opportunity to be here. Of course, as well as UNICEF and WFP, as Ted has highlighted, I also met a lot of women, children in gathering sites across Port Sudan. I also had the opportunity to see what a normal project looks like in an area called Sinkat in 2 hours away from Port Sudan. Let me focus on what I saw and what I heard in Port Sudan. I spoke with several women, and their stories, I must say, keep me awake at night. Issues of you seeing your home obliterated in 1 minute, from 1 minute to the next. A regular trader having access to social security measures, just, getting her insulin injections in or medication in some of the very good hospitals that were in Khartoum, all of a sudden finds herself in 48-degree scorching heat in Port Sudan, a territorial place in Sudan where people of Port Sudan leave to areas like Sinkat because of the heat. And she's in the heat of Port Sudan, wondering where her next insulin shot is going to come from. In the pursuit of safety, nearly 4 million people have fled the fighting, both inside and outside Sudan, as you know, and this is just in over 3 months. 100 days on, the stories are not good. 100 days on, the visibility is not good. The journey to safety is not an easy one, and women and children, as Ted has highlighted, are particularly vulnerable. We are receiving credible reports of all sorts of horrors, and the world needs to wake up and hear this. For those who stay, the situation is not easier. Those who fled also had some challenges. Thousands of people have been killed and injured in conflicts. Again, hotspots like Khartoum, Kordofan, Darfur, communities have been shattered by relentless violence. The usual, and again, lack of water, power, shelter, most basic services. Let's not forget, Khartoum was the capital, and here today we need 12 million people in need of humanitarian access. 85% of medical facilities completely unavailable anymore. People used to travel from all parts of the country to Khartoum to seek medical services. Today, where do they go? Other than, some of them are saying there is no hope. Some have said that to me. More than 40% of people in Sudan are facing high levels of food insecurity. I believe our WFP colleague was here last week, raising some of these concerns. 6 million people are just one step away from famine. Rent that costs $600 a month in Port Sudan costs $2,000 a month. A civil servant who was getting a salary every month is no longer getting that salary every month. And he has to pay, or she has to pay now, $2,000. Civilians in Port Sudan and other locations, not to think about Wad Medani and some of the other towns that are now exploding with internally displaced people. People are hosting people. Friends are hosting friends. Family are hosting family. And they don't have salaries for their children and their families, let alone for their friends and family, extended families. The good news amidst all this gloom is that we are able to deliver humanitarian assistance wherever we can. Ted has talked about some of the numbers. Let me give you a few overall figures as well. 93 humanitarian partners reached at least 2.5 million people with some sort of life-saving assistance across Sudan between April and June. Let's not forget the target is 24 million people. 24 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, of which the target is 18 million. 24 million people is half the population of a country that before 15th of April was doing not too bad. There were needs, but we were not targeting people in the capital. We have been able to get to hard to reach areas. We're able to move trucks from Port Sudan to Darfur, and this is through deconfliction, talking to the parties to the conflict, allowing us to move goods as we could. OCHA, in support of the entire humanitarian system, was able to facilitate some 35,000 metric tons, 780 trucks of relief supplies, UNICEF, WFP, WHO, FAO seeds to farmers who need to plant before the situation plummets even further. Each of these movements requires extensive, painstaking negotiations to ensure that we don't get more deaths of civilians or the 18 aid workers that have been killed so far. And I say death of civilians, the average, the numbers that Ted highlighted. People are dying on a daily basis. Humanitarian aid workers were included in that number. But all of this and all that we're doing is a drop in the bucket compared to the true needs. And humanitarian aid is just a band-aid. Basic social services have completely broken down. Banking systems do not work. And schools have collapsed. And again, UNICEF has really highlighted those. Again, the many children I interacted with, children that you and I know, faces that you and I see, saying, I just want to go back home. I was in Khartoum, I was playing, and then a bomb dropped. These are children. These are women. These are vulnerable teachers and nurses, people who are living every day a normal life across the country. Not just the humanitarian population that we're targeting for humanitarian assistance. To do more, we need funding. This is one of the lowest funding levels I've seen for Sudan in a long time. We are barely 25% funded. We're asking for $2.6 billion. We are barely at 600 million. The exact number, we're at 625 million received of the 2.6 billion requested. And it is August 2023. The war started 3 months ago. We cannot do more without funding, and that's clear. You've seen an article recently in the New Humanitarian that our NGOs are possibly, losing staff because of an inability to fund the projects that we have. We also need fewer barriers in place, and Ted alluded to them. The bureaucratic impediments that we're facing, we are negotiating on a daily, hourly basis with the authorities wherever we can. Unhindered and unconditional access is necessary. And everyone I spoke to, some people said, I don't want food, I don't want water, I just want peace, I want to go home. So this is the message to parties to the conflict as well. Ted talked about the mission to Chad, just to save time. We were there on the same mission, I wouldn't get into it. To avoid further deterioration, let's not forget Sudan and the impact of Sudan. Sudan has 7 borders, and each of these borders, most of these are vulnerable countries. Chad, that has done a phenomenal job of opening its borders. We've got Ethiopia, Eritrea. We've got, South Sudan. We need to be careful that the situation in Sudan is not contained. It will have a devastating impact on the region. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I'll turn the floor over now to questions. First question goes to Edith Lederer from Associated Press.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. My name, as Farhan said, is Edith Lederer from AP. Just let me first clarify the figures. You've said that 24 million people are in need of assistance, which is about half Sudan's population, and that 14 million of them are children, and that you've only so far been able to reach 2.5 million. Are those are the right figures? Okay, so we're now looking at this huge funding gap. Why do you think that there's been such a low response to this appeal? And in your travels there, you've both mentioned that, of course, the thing that's needed most is an end to the fighting. Did you see any signs of a possible end to fighting, to new talks, a ceasefire? Thank you.
Thank you so much, our correspondent from AP. I think you're first on the numbers. Before the 15th of April, we asked for, I believe, I'm asking my colleague to check the exact figure, but the humanitarian appeal was asking for much less. Post 15th of April, we had to do an assessment of the needs. Just imagine a country where the capital city is functioning pretty okay and the humanitarian needs are very little. From there to 12 million people in need. From a country that has, the capital was bombed, and therefore 85% of the health services are no longer functioning. We've been in Sudan, as Ted said, for more than a long time, and 20 years ago I was certainly there, and the focus was on Darfur, it was not on Khartoum. So all of a sudden, humanitarians are having to assist people who were never part of the population that we assisted in the past. while at the same time the population being bombed. We are not in Khartoum as the UN yet. We have partners in Khartoum because we're trying to get into Khartoum 3 months on. Let's also not forget that 6 weeks into the 15th of April disintegration of the situation, the safety and security of everyday people in Khartoum, including a lot of UN agencies, funds, and programs, were at risk. It took us about 4 or 5 weeks to stabilize because some of our colleagues, I know my colleague Imad, may his soul rest in peace, lost his life with his daughter and his wife because he was in an air raid. Our colleagues scattered throughout the country. It took a long time. Now, that said, we gathered our thoughts. We were able to get in with the UN stays and delivers with our partners. And we got in and realized, assessed the needs through all sorts of remote action, looking at figures, looking at secondary data to extrapolate figures and say, well, actually, we need $1 billion plus more. So we're asked for 1 billion or so, 1.2, 1.3, I'm not sure of the exact figure, 1.7 billion, and then we are now asking for $1 billion more. So in terms of actual funding, the 625 million over 1.7 billion would have been much better than the 625 million over 2.6 billion. So the needs have been going up as the funding has been coming in. I have to thank the donors who have been extremely generous and continue to do so. We have the usual top five donors who continue to assist. Here we call for other donors, and we're trying to do our best to get those other donors in. The 2.5 million people, let's not forget that before the 24th of May 2022, a month plus into the crisis, we did not have any movement because the country was at war. So over the last 1 month, 6 weeks, as Ted said, our colleagues who stayed in the face of extreme danger, and we've been in crazy places in the world, and right now Sudan is one of the most dangerous places to operate. So to do 2.5 million people, 780 trucks, mobilizing and negotiating to get in has been no small feat. I'll end with, you are right, 2.5 million over 18.1 million of the 24.7 million is a drop in the ocean, and we need to continue to do more. Thanks.
If I can just...
I was just going to ask, could you tell us the top 5 donors?
I'll get that number for you. I'll get the stats for you in a minute.
No, thanks for the question and for quickly highlighting, in fact, the challenges that we're faced with. I think we've reached 3 million children and their families with health supplies, but it's the order of magnitude you're talking about, essentially. And it just, again, underlines the reason why we went to Sudan with OCHA, with WFP, to highlight the enormity of needs. When we were there 18 years ago, the periphery was having issues, huge problems in Darfur, huge problem in the east. This is the whole country falling apart, including all of the infrastructure that people used to rely on in Khartoum, which is no longer available, which has basically been destroyed. And people are dislocated, civil servants aren't paid. If the services that they're providing in the area of health and water fall apart, then it could be an even more dire situation. So we are calling for the resources to be made available, adding to what has been very generous contributions from a variety of sources, both public and private, and to make sure that, because this is a conflict, that people don't say, well, that's the responsibility of the parties that started this conflict. The population is suffering as a result of people that they don't control. And we absolutely have to make sure that the services, the life-saving services are available to them. In terms of an end to the fighting, there wasn't signals that that's the case. I mean, we met with specifically the authorities in Port Sudan, who indicated some of what they would expect to come out of negotiation. There are talks in Jeddah currently underway, and again, our call is for those talks to yield a ceasefire, to put the emphasis on humanitarian access, and so every step being taken by negotiators in that direction is appreciated. But it is urgent that this happens now.
Okay, Margaret Bashir.
Hi, it's Margaret from Voice of America. Thanks, both of you, for your briefing. Can you just, I'm a little confused. You said 12 million need aid in Khartoum alone? Was that correct?
That's the population of.
Because the population, I
Khartoum.
Googled it, the population's like half that, so I'm a little confused. Where was the 12 million that you mentioned?
That's the population that we're targeting. You know, there's been movements. Let's
Right.
also not forget what I said before. The extrapolation of the numbers is we haven't, usually it's called protection by presence, and everywhere I've been, I've seen. Here in Khartoum, we have not been able to reach be physically present to see. Population of Khartoum plus movement across. Every day there's a different picture. I have to be honest. we were in Port Sudan for 5 days, and every day there were movements. Sometimes we get the numbers right, sometimes we don't. But I think the focus here is on the magnitude. We did not assist people in Khartoum before, as we've both been saying, and now we have to. We did not have to assist people who were getting a social security check every month, and now we have to be part of that. The numbers may change, and the numbers is not the focus here today, colleagues. The issue is the magnitude of the situation and the fact that we are a drop in the ocean when it comes to those who are trying to reach. I also, and forgive me if I misspoke on a particular number on Khartoum, I also wanted to come back on the issue of the funding. It is the usual suspects. It's the US, European Union, the Central Emergency Response Fund, which is managed by the Secretary General, and it's a contribution of many, many donors, large and small, Germany and Sweden, the top 5 donors. And also the US is the 51% of global humanitarian response comes from the US. Thanks.
So actually, could I just finish asking you, so my understanding was that people are leaving Khartoum. I mean, that's the place they're leaving. So, but yet I feel like the need would be leaving Khartoum and going other places is what I guess I'm asking you. So can you just clarify that a bit? And
So
what access do you have in Darfur, particularly West Darfur?
So if I can come and just, there is part of the population of Khartoum and Omdurman that has made its way to Wad Madani and Adbara. I mentioned being in Adbara, which is north of Khartoum and Omdurman, and which has now received the highest level of internally displaced outside of the Darfurs. And that is indeed, as you point out, the population that has been able to leave. And they've moved towards Adbara, towards Wad Madani, further east always toward Kassala, Gedaref. And we also saw people in Port Sudan who had fled from Omdurman and Khartoum. So people who can get out have gotten out. There is still a civilian population trapped in Khartoum. It's less than the population that was at the onset. And again, the statistics officially of who's in Khartoum is based on projections, and we're talking here the greater Khartoum Omdurman area. In Darfur, the situation varies. There is relatively good access in North Darfur, in El Fasher and around El Fasher. But the situation has been extremely difficult in West and Central Darfur, and fighting has also spread to South Darfur. There has been, in the last 10 days, some cross-border access from Chad into West Darfur. But we also need to be able to get to Central Darfur, South Darfur, and to do so on a sustained basis.
We have a question. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to add to what Ted, you were saying. I spoke to what they call emergency responders in Khartoum, and just maybe a small point. People don't want to leave their homes because their homes are being looted and pillaged and so on. So those who leave are leaving out of desperation. There are lots of people who want to stay. And I asked, what does the day in the life of an emergency responder mean in Khartoum today? It is a day that includes not knowing whether you're going to disappear, not knowing whether you're going to be kidnapped, not knowing whether you're going to be interrogated by 2 forces. Khartoum was a thriving capital in a relatively okay country, Sudan, and therefore people don't want to leave. We have a lot of our colleagues who have lost everything, and these are also Sudanese. People are staying. I have an account of a colleague who stayed until the RSF almost killed him and their family. People don't want to leave Khartoum and become an IDP in 48-degree heat in Port Sudan, where you're getting rashes and boils on your children's faces because the heat is intolerable. I just wanted to set that, sort of perspective as well. They don't want to leave, and they want peace, as Ted, you mentioned also.
It's the houses and not losing your house, but sometimes it's your elderly parents. I mean, if we've got a colleague in UNICEF who's got a 84-year-old mother, and she can't physically do the journey, so he has stayed with his mother under the circumstances that Adam was described. And the point is, reaching the displaced who have moved where they have moved to Ad Madani, to Atbara, and everywhere else, that's key. And we also need to be able to get into Khartoum. And again, some of our best and humanitarian sisters and brothers are there. Both our own national staff is on the ground, but colleagues from ICRC, colleagues from MSF, people are putting themselves on the line to do what is necessary to reach the population.
Thank you. We have a question online from Evelyn Leopold.
Yes, thank you. I'm Evelyn Leopold, Globetrotter Media, Globetrotter Media and Past Blue. Could you elaborate on Darfur? Is the so-called Janjaweed, who are now in Khartoum, also still doing what they've done for the last half century? Or you also mentioned that people were fleeing to Western Darfur. Could you kindly elaborate?
So again, a picture in a moment of 2004, 2005 in Darfur, the situation, the issue of scorched earth policy, targeted tribes, issues of words that we didn't want to use because we didn't have the empirical evidence at the time, 2004, 2005. I certainly saw some things in Darfur that still haunt me today. This time in Darfur, it is at scale. It is worse than it was in 2004. And the numbers are higher than they were in 2004, 2003, 2004. As Ted mentioned, the people we spoke to in Chad, on the border, Adre, that small town Adre, said the targeting was continuing. But again, here we speak about the needs that we've seen in terms of people who are in need of humanitarian assistance. There have been reports by those who look into these things, the Office for Human Rights, Amnesty International, on some of the grave violations based on empirical evidence. What we heard was that things happening in Darfur have been, similar to what we saw in 2004. The other thing is, of course, I think, Ted, you mentioned it, and I also mentioned it as well. Despite all of that, we've been negotiating there's a deputy humanitarian coordinator based in Darfur when the situation gets better, but also from Chad, taking in humanitarian assistance from the Chad side. We have been grateful for what the Chadian authorities, as well as the Sudanese authorities, have allowed us to have cross-border movements when the security situation allows. But this is one of the most insecure environments that I've ever been in and seen. What's happening in Darfur continues. What we're trying to do to assist people in need also continues. Thanks.
If I can add to the question, and yesterday, the Special Representative of the Secretary General that heads UNITAM issued a statement strongly condemning the indiscriminate targeting of civilians and population in public facilities by the RSF and allied militias in the locality of Serba, 45 kilometers north of Janina in West Darfur, and expressing concern about similar incidents in Yala, South Darfur, and Zalinji, Central Darfur. So, clearly, again, we're all saying, history cannot repeat itself in this regard. Over 90% of the refugees crossing into Adre in Chad are from the Masalit community. So that tells you who is having to flee and why they're having to flee. And I would refer you to the UNITAM statement in this regard.
Thanks. One more question from Edie.
As I recall from the Darfur conflict, it was basically the Janjaweed going after we have the Arabs and the African population, which is Sudan's divide. And as we have all read, the Rapid Support Forces come out of the Janjaweed. And so are you saying that when you talk about targeting and you talk about the Masalit, I don't think a lot of people here know who the Masalit are. Is this targeting a repetition of the same targeting from the Darfur conflict?
Thank you. From what we're seeing, I think I'll just stick to what Ted said and what we saw. The accounts from people are saying that certain tribes were targeted more than others. And here, I think the focus right now in this briefing is on how do we get assistance into the different areas, Khartoum, Wad Medani, Port Sudan, to a lesser extent, the Kordofans, and how do we stay and deliver no matter what. But the reports are showing from, as I said, from Amnesty International or from the Office for the Human Rights, the different iterations or what it looks like from what it looked like in 2004 and what we have in 2023. Thanks.
Just, I mean, the SRSG spoke to this yesterday. I think the SG, OHCHR have spoken about needing to stop targeted attacks on communities. I think as humanitarians, our point is that that needs to stop, and we need to have the access and the means, the financial means, to be able to do this critically important work that our colleagues are putting themselves on the line day in and day out to do. Adam gave the overall figures of the appeal and how it's funded. UNICEF has roughly the same figures. We're at $840 million is our appeal, and we're roughly same, 23% funded in August. So thanks to everyone who's contributed. We encourage others to chip in and make a difference. If the kind of situation that we have in White Nile spreads, where acute watery diarrhea, measles, and malnutrition, are in the same place, children are dying. If that is not contained, if we see similar situation elsewhere, then we're going to be seeing an even worse situation than we have today. That's hard to believe, but it's possible.
Just to clarify, is the UNICEF appeal part of the, I think it was 2.6 billion?
So is the case. The individual agencies collectively add up to the total figure that Adam gave.
Thank you.
Yes, in the back, Al
Hi.
Jazeera.
Hi, my name is Nadia Satuma, Al Jazeera English. So I know earlier, I was listening upstairs, so sorry that I ran down to ask my question. You mentioned that 14 million children have been displaced, and my question is there any way to gauge what this means for educational development? How do you know what kind of impact, particularly on education, this will have on young people?
So just to be clear with the numbers, 14 million children are in need of humanitarian assistance. Let me make sure I get you the right figures again in looking at my documents, but that's correct. 1.7 million children have been driven from their homes, in addition to the 1.9 that were there before. So that gives you an order of magnitude. But you're absolutely right. We are worried about the school year. I was actually just able to see a really interesting program when I was there that needs to go to a different scale, but we've got about 200,000 of those children literally using tablets to do some kind of learning in these 400 child-friendly spaces that I described. And again, that's 200,000 against 14 million children, right? But still, we're trying to do some learning. The big issue is the start of the school year in September, October. And again, it tends to open between September and October. So as we speak, the discussions are on the way with the education authorities to see where schools can resume. So obviously in Darfur and Kordofan is going to be really difficult, maybe with the exception of North Darfur with Nyala. But there's a fair bit of a number of the states where it should be possible to resume education. Again, it goes back to this issue of making the resources available. And a big part of the advocacy is to make sure that children, as they're displaced, can join the schools of the place where they've been displaced. And so when we were in Atbara, the local authorities had used halfway finished public housing to secure housing for those families. We spoke about those children joining the schools where they're displaced. And again, those discussions are underway, but the authorities are open to that. So the big push is between now and September, essentially.
All right, I think that is it for questions. So again, I would like to thank our guests, Ida Muserno, Ted Chaiban. Thanks very much, and have a great rest of your days. And for you in the press, please stay in the room because Polina Kubiak, the spokesperson for the President of the General Assembly, is up next.